Thank you everyone for coming and joining us for our final REI, Race, Ethnicity, Immigration Colloquium. This is sponsored by the Institute for Governmental Studies. I want to thank Luca, Ezra, and the whole REI team. Thank Christina Mora, came in. Very excited today to have a presentation from Prince Grace. I'm just going to introduce Prince, and then Prince will share some of his work with us. Prince Grace is an artist researcher and doctoral candidate in sociology at Northwestern University. His theoretically innovative and wide-ranging research examines how knowledge practices shape power relations and world building. Prince's master's thesis, for example, grapples with community-based police monitoring projects during the civil rights era. He theorizes such projects as experimental generators of what he theorizes as undersight, or quote, socio-technical practices that actors in asymmetrical power relations have developed to monitor authorities, intervene in the exercise of power, and call authorities to account for misconduct. His thesis won the inaugural Ida B. Wells Troy Duster Award from the American Sociological Association's Science, Technology, and Knowledge section. Prince's dissertation, which we're going to hear about today, explores the more than human futures of race, colonialism, and political community. It traces how the development of human rights systems from World War I through early space age transformed human beings into a human race, a collective identity, interest, and birthright. His research has been supported by the Buffett Institute for Global Affairs, the Kaplan Institute's Public Humanities at Northwestern, the Social Science Research Council, and various other entities. Very excited to hear Prince's work. I chaired Prince's dissertation, so particularly excited about the work that he's doing. I'm glad he's able to come to Berkeley and share some of this work with us. Thank you, Prince.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining for my today. This is a chapter of my dissertation, the sort of third piece of a kind of three-piece set that looks at the evolution of human rights systems on the aftermath of World War I through the early space age, and looking at how it has sort of shaped the political and cultural relationship between human beings, but also between human and non-human beings as well. So my gratitude to Michael for inviting me to speak to you all today, and also to Luca, Ezra, and Dawn especially, who found a way to get me out of Texas at a time that like everybody was trying to get out of Texas yesterday. And on that note, it is an honor to be talking about the moon today, after their grand performance yesterday, which I witnessed from the I want to show off the photography that I took from the Dallas Fort Worth yesterday. Okay, sorry, no worries. So I was in the Dallas Fort Worth airport yesterday during the time of the eclipse, and it was incredible to experience the coordinated choreographic power of what are ultimately two oversized rocks and a ball of plasma, but that could shape the movements and mobilities of millions, including declarations of states of emergency and coordination across multiple levels of government. The moon has long shaped our systems of governance, political relationships, and even our identities and practices of identification. And so my presentation is about how one of these identifications came to be institutionalized within the broader project of the extension, and specifically the colonization of the human species into outer space, what is termed interchangeably as humankind, mankind, humanity, or the human race. So first, in a letter submitted to the Secretary and Senior Administrations of the U.S. Department of Transportation at the end of 2023, the President of the Navajo Nation, Dr. Vu Ngiran, expressed deep concern and profound disappointment at the authorization of a launch by the United Launch Alliance's Vulcan Centaur. On board would be a payload from Celestis, a private company established in 1994 that provides, in the language of its website, memorial space flights, and a space memorial experience. For the low cost of $2,495, Celeste says, we'll help you choose your destination in space so that you will be among the stars eternally. That is, Celeste will send your cremated remains or the remains of a loved one into space. The Navajo president pointed out to the DOT, the Department of Transportation, which issued permits for space launches, that it had failed, as it had for decades, to consult with indigenous communities before sending remains to the moon. In addition to cheapening previous apologies and violating consultative practices, the president wrote, quote, "It is crucial to emphasize that the moon holds a sacred position in many indigenous cultures, including ours. We view it as a part of our spiritual heritage, an offerance of reverence and respect. The act of depositing human remains and other material, which could be perceived as discard in any other location, the moon is tantamount to the desecration of this sacred space." 3 months ago, the Coalition of Large Tribes, or COLT, submitted a letter in support of the Navajo Nation's official protest. Marvin Weatherwax, the chairman of COLT, wrote, "As the Navajo Nation explained, NASA in 1998 attempted to do the same thing. And after being contacted by the Navajo Nation and confronted with the spiritual and cultural harm the deposit of remains on the moon would cause Navajo people, apologized and promised tribal consultation would occur prior to consideration of any new mission to place human remains on the moon. Is it NASA's intent to once again break the promises made to the indigenous people of the United States?" End quote. In an article summarizing the dispute in Scientific American, a scholar of space law, Michelle Hanlon, is quoted as saying, quote, "The fundamental principle is that exploration and use of space is free for all. But," she continues, "until regulation materializes, complaints like those from the Navajo Nation are a good reminder of the importance of bringing as many voices as possible into ongoing and long-term discussions about what limits, if any, should exist for humanity's actions beyond Earth," end quote. These two phrases, "as many voices as possible" and "humanity's actions beyond Earth," illustrate the representational problem of humanity. Who speaks and acts on behalf of humankind? Why, for instance, is a private funeral company's burial services representative of humanity's actions, but the protest of a coalition representing more than a dozen indigenous nations and tribes is not? This rather familiar politics of representing humanity, prime examples of what Sylvia Wynter has called the overrepresentation of man and the ethno-class conception of the human, may obscure a more fundamental question. What is humankind such that it's representable at all? Suddenly, we find ourselves burdened with larger questions related to the political ecology of the cosmos, including more than human political relations. Whose community has the moon, long before humans ever set foot on it, been a part of? What right to place permanent materials on the moon does any human being have? And what implications does that right have? And where, if we want to understand humanity as a social construct, does the sociology of humankind begin? This work builds on the insights of scholars such as Ilana Feldman, Miriam Tickton, and Berkeley's own Fang Che, who have offered 3 productive provocations that lay the foundation for a launchpad such as sociology. First, in Feldman and Tickton's work, the idea of humankind as a constituency, a population, an object of governance given substance through global governmentality. And second, in a different take on the representational problem of humankind, exemplified by the dispute over the moon and human remains, there is the problem of the representational claim, to borrow a term from Michael Soward, performed by the rule makers, permit givers, and commercialists purporting to be acting on behalf of all humanity. From these dispositions, a sociology of humankind becomes possible through analytical correspondences with studies of governmentality, including the construction and governance of populations and subjects through law, diplomacy, and bureaucracy. And this approach treats the classification of humankind and, by implication, non-humankinds, similarly to the construction of national populations, and ethno-racial categorization through state classification practices, census politics, and demographic engineering. Drawing on this approach, I examined the co-production of outer space governance and humankind as a political and cultural group with a collective identity, interest, and dominion in the domain of outer space. Moreover, I examine outer space activities as a mode through which humankind is not only constructed, but performed, where global space governance, transnational technoscience, and space missions do humanity in ways that extend, for instance, the performance of pan-humanity through the United Nations. More generally, as new research emerges, focusing specifically on humanity identification, including the identification of all humanity, or IWAH scale, I ask whether such identification, the heart of theories and doctrines of cosmopolitanism, is sufficient or even desired in confronting the problems of racism and the more than human problems and futures of politics. If we begin to walk the road of identity formation analysis, what, for instance, might we learn from other social theories considered in more than human ways, including theories of ethno-nationalism, ethnic mobilization, and fractionalization, group dynamics and in-group, out-group biases, stratification and inequality, settler colonialism? So to begin to address these broad yet important questions, I begin by tracing the construction of humans' identity, agency, rights, and interests in outer space and the corresponding inauguration of exopolitics, the form of geopolitics that incorporates not only terrestrial spaces, but also extraterrestrial. Ultimately, I argue that understanding not only the history, but the future of race and colonialism requires a configuration of the temporality of rice, colonization, and race itself. One premised on the idea that before the first vessel disembarks, before the first settlement is erected, colonization has already happened. In the planning and design, the recruitments, the speculations and projections. More concretely, my research question asks, what is colonial about the human colonization of space? How is humankind colonized? And I selected this case as a part of three broader aims for my dissertation. First, I'm looking to contribute to approaches to the study of race that resist not only methodological nationalism, which global and transnational studies of race have been doing an excellent job of, but also resisting what Nurit David has called scale-blind analysis. Scale and scaling, as in the incorporation of space into the geopolitical domain, becomes central to analysis. Second, and relatedly, I want to examine intergovernmental organizations and global institutions such as the UN as sites that are critical yet underexplored in the processes of race making. And third, I wanted to examine the human race itself as a racial construct, challenging notions that pan-humanity or humankind are necessarily antidotes to racism and race thinking. A few things about the case. I'll just put up a little bit of how I'm thinking about colonization as a preview. A few things about this, the particularities of this case, however. The coalescence of global space governance is generally recognized as emerging from the international geopolitical the international geophysical year in 1957 to 1958, which was as much a project of international scientific cooperation across multiple earth sciences as a demonstration of the techno-scientific capabilities, and for some, a need for concerted efforts to grow human techno-scientific development. The first successful artificial satellite, Sputnik 1, was launched by the Soviet Union in conjunction with the IGY, the International Geophysical Year, along with two others, Sputnik 2, and on the US's part, Explorer 1. And the National Aeronautics and Space Act was passed in the US during this period, establishing NASA. In 1958, just going to skip a little bit ahead here to give you the timeline. In 1958, the UN General Assembly passed a resolution establishing an ad hoc committee on the peaceful use of outer space, or COPUOS, passing a sequel resolution to the following year, making the committee permanent. The committee was initially made up of delegates representing some 24 countries and composed of two subcommittees, the Technical and Scientific Subcommittee and the Legal Subcommittee, the latter of which I focus on. The LSC, or the Legal Subcommittee, led the effort to establish a set of legal principles according to which international law would come to integrate outer space into, through which international law would come to incorporate outer space into governance. And so in 1963, the Declaration of Legal Principles Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space was adopted. And then, desiring a legally binding instrument, negotiations began to convert the principles into what became, according to space law scholar Stephen Garreau, the Magna Carta of space law in 1967. And I'm only going to say this one time, it's a very long title. The Treaty on Principles Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies, which I'll just refer to as the Outer Space Treaty. This treaty remains the only overarching framework of legal principles governing outer space activities. In a general way, there are a lot of different treaties and agreements that have to do with the technical specificities of what happens in outer space, but none that really designates general principles and aspirations of why humans are in outer space in general, the kinds of actors and relations that constitute human activity in space. It was followed in 1979 by the Moon Treaty, and as I mentioned, a series of frameworks that included astronaut rescue, the registration of space-directed objects, and state liability issues, especially around property. I should note that this period also saw crucial related developments in the realm of science and popular culture, including the birth of the modern search for extraterrestrial life, or SETI movement, with Frank Drake's 1960 Project Ozma experiment in radio astronomy, as well as the 1966 premiere of what has become arguably the most popular science fiction franchise in the world, Star Trek. So my analysis primarily draws on records from the United Nations, which I encourage everyone to take a look at. It's digital, and almost any research question you could imagine intersects with their archives because they have a lot of records from organizations that also interacted with them. Truly a great space. Also the League of Nations, which I do in my dissertation more generally, is fully digitized and has just wonderful resources and a wonderful staff to help as well. I also looked at the records of the Lyndon B. Johnson Presidential Library in Austin. The Johnson administration was heavily involved in the negotiation of the Outer Space Treaty. And actually, one of the underexamined legacies of LBJ in general is that he was a huge proponent of outer space law, governance, and scientific development. He began speaking to the UN on outer space issues in the late 1950s and continued throughout the negotiation of these different frameworks. So what I would like to focus on is what I term the exo-colonial framework. But before getting into the framework itself, I want to clarify what I mean when discussing the colonial. And so here, my work isn't an attempt to further muddy the waters of, what colonization is, or who was colonial or wasn't colonial, what was imperial versus colonial, but rather to attend specifically to colonization as a variable historical practice productive of diverse forms. And this involves recovering, so to speak, the colony from the sea of colonialism, analyzing how the colony and its coloniality materialize, how they take form and become consequential, how they matter. And in so doing this, this study is an effort to conceptualize colonization from the root as the political technology of colony making and the process of becoming colony, right? How is it that individuals, groups, communities are transformed into colonists as a part of the colonization process? So all of this involves colony work, and is to sort of transform space into a theater of power, identity, and transformation, upheld by the pillars of, as I will shortly talk about, embodiment, frontiering, othering, and dominion. The forms of coloniality are many, and practices of colonization may and often overlap, as in the historical tethering that Anne-Laure Stower identifies or the layered colonizations of Native Hawaiians through US constructed leprosy colonies and Pacific resettlement projects. I would also point to recent work that's been done on polar colonialism, the different kind of colonial structure of the Antarctic region, which is very different from the Arctic region, the Antarctic region being one that has some semblance of international governance, and it's sort of a set of treaties that are supposed to govern that space in addition to the territorial sovereign claims. But there are also a variety of other colonies, right, that have popped up over time. Confederate colonies after the Civil War and throughout Latin America for people who were trying to sort of create these utopian spaces and flee the US after their defeat. There have been efforts to talk about penal colonization and penal transportation and its connections to settler colonial regimes, obviously in places like Australia, which saw people who had been convicted as criminals transformed in a variety of ways into different types of colonists and being transported across the world. And so in joining this long and many branched lineage of colonial rights regimes, colonization projects, is exocolonialism, a concept I derived from the astronomical sciences to describe the colonial regime based on extraterrestrial occupation and dominion. The exocolonial framework can more concretely be understood for the moment as the geopolitics of outer space shaped by political actors and power relations on Earth and their extension into new environments. In the literature on intersections of colonialism and space exploration, two dimensions of this kind of coloniality have been surfaced. The first being the terrestrial ecopolitics of extraterrestrial exploration, including the expropriation of indigenous land for scientific instruments and stations, and the marginalization of indigenous more than terrestrial ecologies, as in the dispute that opened my presentation. The second is the colonial logics of outer space, including the extension of the colonization, settler, and frontier concepts themselves, the centrality of occupation and exploitation to the idea and practice of space exploration, and the speculative proto-structure of an extraterrestrial social and political system, including logics of civilizational development, primitivism, and race. What I would like to point to in examining the exocolonial framework are the kinds of disjunctures that form its logics. And this is a key mechanism for why this framework was created in the first place and why it persists. So I draw on the concept of disjunctures, which is from Judith Shepp, to describe the reproduction of the logics and dispositions that progressive projects purport to oppose. So in trying to get away from certain types of logics, they inadvertently reproduce those same logics through the kinds of practices that are entrenched. The first of these is anti-colonial colonialism, which is the mobilization of practices of occupation and exploitation as antidotes to historical colonial practices. Specifically, the replacement of imperial national colonialism, including national appropriation and competition, with a denationalized pan-human colonial regime. Anti-colonial colonialism has been a mode of political experimentation for more than a century. The design of the interwar mandate system, which the League of Nations oversaw, was explicitly framed as an experiment in international colonial administration intended to internationalize the governance of mandated territories as frontiers in political experiments of international governance and development. This was supposed to be a kind of counterpoint to the national imperial practices, which were seen as kind of contrary to the principle of self-determination that was developing around the period of World War I, and especially in its aftermath, but that ultimately just reinscribed colonial administration just in an internationalized form. I draw the very concept of anti-colonial colonialism from Jessica Namakal, whose study of Oroville in southern India as this utopian international commune that ultimately ended up occupying and displacing the local community, prompted an analysis of how ostensibly anti-colonial internationalist visions reproduce the logics and practices of colonialism. The second disjuncture that I point to is anti-racist racecraft. which was primarily expressed through the construction of a human race through a process of aggregation, suture, and the production of a kind of superordinate identity, right? So we're not human races, we are a human race, a single human race. This kind of logic occurred in conjunction with the more expansive anti-racist racecraft that was very prominent in the aftermath of World War II. One element involved the scientific reconstruction of the race question, as it was called, through official international convenings transformed over the course of 4 UNESCO, or United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization conferences, and statements that were submitted to shift the framework from a kind of biological underpinning of race to the causes and consequences of racism. A second involved the proliferation of the idea of non-discrimination and the use of non-discrimination clauses in international law, including the adoption of first the Declaration and then the 1965 Convention on Racial Discrimination. These developments simultaneously embedded race in the demographic structure of the global and generated new forms of global racial knowledge production through compliance monitoring, investigation, reporting, and petitioning. The third and final is humankind, and that is what we will be focusing on today. The exocolonial framework, I'll just skip ahead a bit. It's important to say that this framework is based on certain ideas that are disputed in terms of their actual legal status. Some legal scholars say that they're principles, others say that they're doctrines, others say that they are rights, rules, some combination thereof. And rather than trying to sort out which is correct, I argue actually that this very ambiguity is itself, I think, indicative of the kind of speculative nature of this framework and the kind of productive work that it is doing. A principle of free exploration and use of outer space is, of course, distinct from the right to freely explore and use. Principles may be normative aspirations, and doctrines may be a kind of heightened ideological and formal coherence, taking on a kind of deeper force, but unlike rules, they don't necessarily bind the conduct of actors. Rights, however, structure the kinds of claims that can be made and by whom, while also imposing obligations on actors tasked with preserving those rights. So ultimately, what they are will have to be resolved, but the resolution can't happen until the actual activities that constitute what they're supposed to be referring to take place. And this is the kind of interesting space that space law is in right now, which is that many of the things that a kind of schema is being developed around haven't happened. We haven't actually built lunar stations yet. And certainly anything like a kind of permanent human settlement or any kind of diplomatic engagements beyond Earth are still nothing but speculative. What I would like to point to, though, is that these provisions, whether rights or proto-rights, offer a common frame of reference through which actors are defined and interrelated, and a particular set of activities, outer space activities, that is, become knowable, discussable, and actionable in common, providing the groundwork for what Sheila Jasanoff has termed civic epistemology. So I'm interested in how people know about what is happening in outer space, how they know these things together, how they understand who is a part of the kind of authority of outer space, what kinds of subjects are understood collectively as being a part of the domain of outer space as a political field. The exocolonial framework basically has 4 rights-based principles. The first is the free exploration, use, and access of outer space for all. The second is freedom of scientific investigation, information, and application. The third is the prohibition on the national appropriation of space. And the fourth is collective representation by and responsibility for, humanitarian responsibility for, astronaut envoys. And I'll get to that kind of bridging in just a moment. I also want to consider these principles in relation to the primary actors that are recognized through the Outer Space Treaty framework, the activehood and subjectivity that the framework and the treaty establish. Mankind, states, non-governmental actors, and astronauts. again, this weird sort of fourth category that is of particular interest in sort of developing the first legal principles of space. While two of these are relatively standard subjects of international law, states and non-governmental actors, a third, astronauts, is relatively well understood, but why it's a little bit tricky, as I said, it's coming up. But the fourth, mankind, is a rather vague statement, or excuse me, a rather vague subject. Scholars have disagreed over whether humankind is or could even be capable of being a legal subject. Recent summaries of space law have bluntly stated that without a capacity to exercise rights, then you can't have a legal subject. What mechanism, what body exists through which humankind becomes representable and a legal authority can be petitioned with certain types of claims. And in this sense, it's very related to questions of collective rights regimes, right? If the interwar system of minority rights, for instance, constructs group rights, but who is able to make claims, who is able to be a spokesperson for a group on behalf of the group and its interests. So here is where sociology becomes, I think, useful, because you actually get to study who is constructing these kinds of interests, who is speaking on behalf, and particularly how are the relationships between different kinds of groups established through these kinds of representative claiming. I want to first talk about embodiment, which concerns how people and activities in space come to be figured as tangible forms, agents, representatives of a collective, extended, transplantable humanity. It's important to note that there are layers of representation and representational acts that are required to produce anything resembling a voice, an agent, or an agency of states, let alone humankind. Constituency structures, elections, appointment processes, and the coordination of official authorizations, such as votes, formal negotiations, and press statements, enact the acting of states. But nevertheless, for schematic purposes, we can identify two actors critical to the embodiment of humankind: states and astronauts. States are figured as both individual actors with their own rights and interests, as well as figures entangled with the representation of mankind. But there is ambiguity with respect to exactly the kinds of representative claims states can make with respect to humankind. Are they literal embodiments of humankind? Are they representatives, or are they trustees? And so in the text, you see there's a kind of ambiguity that exists. States, on the one hand, are the primary agents of space exploration and access, guaranteed explicit rights to outer space use, but they're also the guardians of mankind's interests, stated in the Outer Space Treaty. They are obligatory points of engagement for non-governmental access to outer space. So if you want to launch something into space, then you have to be registered by your state. The government has to approve. They will submit information about what it is that you're sending to centralize UN registry, or they're supposed to. And so there is this, again, this sort of layered dimension of representation with respect to actorhood in space. States are also facilitators of international scientific cooperation, but they're also potential threats to humankind's collective use of space through national appropriation. So the entire reasoning for the Outer Space Treaty, the development of legal principles, is everyone was scared that the world was about to be nuked. It was the start of the Cold War, and the continued development of these new weapons of mass destruction led to the desire to create a framework so that outer space would not come to be a militarized, weaponized space, particularly by the US and the Soviet Union. A second and equally important agent of humankind was the astronaut, whose status and protection occupied the attention of both the initial ad hoc committee created in the UN to address space issues, the permanent committee, and the spacefaring states during the convergence of sort of technical and legal questions that were taken up in conference. From its first proposal for a declaration of legal principles, the Soviet Union declared that, quote, states shall regard all astronauts as envoys of mankind in outer space, end quote. which became the foundation for Article 5 of the Outer Space Treaty, which uses that language, envoys of mankind in outer space. As envoys of mankind, astronauts were objects of care and protection, regardless of their country of origin, and aiding them when they were in distress, recovering them upon landing, and returning them to where they originated was the duty of all countries. The term envoy, however, was picked up by certain legal scholars who said, why did you say envoy? Because that's a very specific term, and began to think about the implications that this might have for the future. The second element is frontiering, which involves the design of borderlands, the construction of a space of ungovernedness and governedness, and in so doing, dividing or establishing domains. This is something that we're very, I think, familiar with in traditional analyses of particularly settler colonialism, how the idea of the frontier operated as both a moral space, as a physical space, and a legal space. And while there is a general insistence in legal quarters that outer space is not treated in the same way as the so-called New World under the doctrine of discovery, but rather as a commons, outer space governance was premised on what was characterized as the extension of the rule of law to a previously lawless space. President John F. Kennedy, addressing the General Assembly in September of 1961, declared, "As we extend the rule of law on Earth, so we must extend it to man's new domain, outer space," end quote. The 1963 Declaration of Legal Principles states that, quote, "The activities of states in the exploration and use of outer space shall be carried on in accordance with international law, including the Charter of the United Nations," end quote, which became the basis of Article 3 of the OST. Outer space was one of 3 prominent spaces frontiered by global international law in the third quarter of the 20th century, the others being Antarctica and the seabed. Although the multinational governance structure of Antarctica combines claims of territorial sovereignty with this kind of international governance regime, elements of the Antarctic colonial model correspond to the emergent form collective human colonization associated with outer space, the establishment of research stations, the use of scientists as the particular agents of how authority claims are also maneuvered. Those are very common to both Antarctica, outer space, and also this was a part of the thinking around the seabed as well. Frontiering includes the establishment of a domain, which involved the delimitation of space and the specification of activities. In a landmark 1958 speech at the UN, which paved the way for the first Outer Space Committee, then US Senator Lyndon B. Johnson stated, quote, "We of the United States do not acknowledge that there are landlords of outer space who can presume to bargain with the nations of the earth on the price of access to this new domain. We must not and need not corrupt this great opportunity by bringing to it the very antagonisms which we may by encourage, overcome, and leave behind forever through a joint adventure into this new realm," end quote. And so what I'm interested in is the ways in which political actors were really thinking about a new domain, a new space of politics during this period, and how the conceptualization of that new space was also shaping the kinds of identities that people were taking on. Grounding these uncertainties was the aim to make space a realm of scientific freedom and development, which formed the basis of the collective interest in humankind, alongside the protection from weaponization. And so thinking about the intersections of science, law, and governance, as well as the bureaucratic, administrative kinds of apparatuses that were beginning to develop around outer space activities, we see a lot of that bureaucratizing work that is very common in trying to establish some kind of governing actor, but also the kinds of identities that constitute a political community. The third dominion is, I think, one of the most critical pieces in thinking about what are the implications of humans trying to not only go into outer space, but to govern it. The principle of the free exploration and use, which is also in earlier frameworks termed the exploration and exploitation of outer space, as the province of mankind, is directly embedded in the language of the Outer Space Treaty. And in the Moon Treaty, the moon is actually designated as the common heritage of mankind, which is a very specific construct that has become very controversial for states because declaring a space as a common heritage essentially means that there are 5 elements that are important to how that space is governed. The first is that there is the non-appropriation of the designated area. The second is that the space is managed by international authority. The third is that there is an equitable sharing of benefits from exploitation of the common heritage area. The fourth is that there is a peaceful use of the area. And finally, that the protection and preservation of resources is for the benefit and interest of mankind as a whole. Common heritage areas have been widely conceptualized, if not always codified, including the seabed, Antarctica, the moon, the atmosphere, meteors, the geostationary orbit, radio frequencies, genetic resources, tropical rainforests, food resources, and cultural heritages. But inhibiting the adoption has been the commonness of the common heritage principle, which limits the ability of both governments and private entities to control and exploit resources. This, for example, is one of the reasons why the Outer Space Treaty, which has more than 100 state parties, is seen as the general framework, while the Moon Treaty, which was open for signature in 1979, it only has a little more than a dozen state parties, that's one of the reasons for that kind of division. There were a lot of states, even the states who were negotiating the treaty in the first place, with the idea that they would not be able to kind of control resources in the way that they kind of were essentially used to doing. And so this emphasis was on denationalizing exploitation and promoting collective authority. The common heritage principle found correspondences and developments from the preceding decades. And this is where it's important, I think, to show linkages between this kind of framework that was being developed and those colonial frameworks that pre-existed it. Article 1, paragraph 2C of the 1945 Constitution of UNESCO mandated the specialized agency with the sort of task of, quote, assuring the conservation and protection of the world's inheritance of books, works of art, and monuments of history and science, end quote. And while seemingly kind of benign and fairly cosmopolitan in principle, it's important to understand how world heritage was conceptualized both in terms of international administration and how it had figured into historical colonial practices. The interwar mandate system, for instance, installed a regime of antiquities laws that was specific to the mandates of Southwest Asia, including Iraq, Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon, which held that artifacts that had long been of interest to the Western European archaeologists who sought to go into this space and bring them back into European museums had until then been locked up in the Ottoman Empire. So these new kind of like world heritage regimes not only sanctioned, but compelled and incentivized the extraction of human created materials from the land, subjecting culturally placed artifacts to a circulatory system of human archaeology that dislodged and transported objects to metropolitan universities, museums, and other displays, again, in the name of a kind of collective human heritage. And in some cases, very blatantly, were a part of imperial displays of power, such as in Britain's kind of famous imperial exhibitions, where it tried to show off the sort of natural resources of all of its colonies. That was a part of this World Heritage regime. What I would also like to point out, and just sort of in closing this framework, are what it means to think about, first of all, this is a speculative framework, one that is trying to govern, to develop strategies of governance for a space where it's not even clear exactly what is being governed, but also to think about the implications of what has been established. If space law designates a kind of autonomy of humankind in outer space, the more than human perspective asks, in relation to what? The exploration and use of outer space is the province of mankind, and that mankind has envoys in the form of astronauts. So for whom or what purpose did such envoys exist? In his 1972 assessment of the legal content of the Outer Space Treaty in the San Diego Law Review, Stephen Garova, a prominent figure in the early development of space law, insists there is no representative connotation to the concept for the moment. However, he continues, quote, "It is possible that with the passage of time, the term will crystallize into a meaning involving representation. If man ever came into contact with other intelligent beings, mankind could well be represented by its astronaut envoys, and in that case, the phrase could convey a meaningful content," end quote. The Outer Space Treaty makes no mention of aliens, extraterrestrials, or any other popular or scientific term for non-human beings from elsewhere. The framework is for and about human beings and their relationships to each other, and minimally the natural environment of outer space. This would seem to preclude the claim that it has anything to do with human non-human relations, but I would say not so fast. Although the Outer Space Treaty and the follow-up Moon Treaty did not directly address human settlement or human non-human relations, these issues were not entirely absent from the agenda. A report from the legal subcommittee in the late 1950s noted that the question of settlement had been discussed, of human settlement, that is, but it was ultimately sidelined. They wrote, quote, "While scientific programs envisioned relatively early exploration of celestial bodies, human settlement and extensive exploitation of resources were not likely in the near future. For this reason, the committee believed that problems relating to the settlement and exploitation of celestial bodies did not require priority treatment," end quote. Similarly, the Moon Treaty makes reference to the need to protect human life, as well as any indication of organic life that might be found in space. Law didn't need to fill the space, though. That was what popular culture and science, speculative science, were doing. So the emergence of the SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence movement, was providing a lot of the frameworks for how we think about the actors of outer space. This is baked into the very calculation, very equations that were used to estimate the possibility of life elsewhere. The Drake equation by Frank Drake, who I mentioned earlier, includes as its terms, as one of its variables, a technological civilization, civilizations that are not technological. And this concept of civilization, which has its own colonial sort of connotations, has also been adopted in popular culture spaces and sort of used interchangeably with race, people, culture, kind, the sort of constellation of concepts that all have these kind of racial connotations. And so in conclusion, I would just ask then, what then is to be done about this kind of framework? It's sort of inert. There are a lot of questions presently about even the sort of technical provisions, the basic aspirations that it provides for, which is to not put, weapons of mass destruction in outer space. Very recently, there has been concern that Russia is discussing putting weapons of mass destruction in outer space, that there may be a number of breakdowns in nuclear treaties that could potentially impact the Outer Space Treaty. And so the uncertainty of this framework, I think, opens on to, 5 implications that I'll just briefly go through. And this is primarily for research and problem working both within the social sciences and for anyone interested in outer space engineering, design, and practice. The first is the kind of dual temporal reconfiguration that I think is at work within this framework. Needing to reconfigure the temporality of colonialism and colonization to include the process of colony making, the process of becoming colonial that precedes any moment of actual settlement. The second is also a reconfiguration of the temporality of the future, to draw in a kind of very chewed up phrase, The idea, right, the future is now. Well, in a very literal sense, a lot of the structure of future political orders are baked into these speculative frameworks for these kind of emergent domains. The second implication has to do with thinking about the contradictions and utopian projects in general, and humanism in particular. Anti-colonial colonialism alters the political rationale, but not the political rationality of colonialism. Though the agent shifts, the logic persists, and the persistent emphasis on liberty as opposed to ecology-derived responsibilities has made confronting human-driven ecological crises all the more difficult on this planet. And so, in thinking about the kinds of more than human ecologies in which even this planet is embedded, in what ways might more ecologically sensitive frameworks for human activities be developed? And this is something that has been very much a concern among certain folks in like outer space politics circles. The third is in thinking about internalizing lessons from catch-up work that we have had to play in other fields as well, of thinking about the efforts to expand rights and frameworks and inclusions and to recognize subjects has been a very difficult challenge within the processes of expanding frameworks of citizenship, of thinking about the extension of rights to previous subjects who had not previously held rights. And we know that this creates a structure that is very difficult, let's say, to remedy, to provide redress for. And so in what ways can we use what is now a world-building moment, right, to think of the future, to begin to anticipate those problems, and rather than kind of reproducing the core logics of the things that cause problems in the first place. The fourth is just recalling the utopian dimensions of social science. This is a really big part of a lot of people who are working in action research, participatory research, things that are actually involved in reconstructing the lived practices of people such that they come to incorporate other modes of being and relating and knowing. And finally, if this kind of reconstruction becomes an aim, what are the conditions of the paradigm shift? And thankfully, there are a lot of emergent frameworks that are providing really useful things to start considering, right? There are these ideas of more than human legalities. How do you conceptualize law in a more than human way? What would more than human rights look like? Not just animal rights or non-human rights, but to ground even the concept of rights in the kinds of ecological materialities that exist between humans and non-human beings. And so what I hope for these emergent projects, as well as my own, is that they challenge habits, dispositions, or less charitably, ruts of thinking and doing, and in so doing that they participate in the practical work of redisposing sensibility in ways that might dislodge our troubled past from an emergent future. Thank you.
Nice.
We have plenty of time for questions, comments, reactions. Who'd like to go first?
Let me start with the first dilemma which you posed. So how should we think about this issue, the tension between this company that wants to put human reigns on the moon, make money from it, and a group of Native Americans who claim that the moon, they have some claim on it?
So I think one of the questions is who gets to act in such a way that will have implications for everyone else. And so this representational problem ultimately is a problem who gets to make decisions and who has to live with those decisions. One of the, I think, things that I'm trying to point towards in thinking about time and temporality is that if you are already acting in such a way that is changing the material environment of space, there is no going back from that, right? And so this is one of the issues that has been sort of brought up by a lot of indigenous political leaders, which is that the concept of consultation is sort of treated as like an ethical kind of, imperative. But the reality is that it's very material, that once ecologies are changed, you can't unring that bell. And so colonization, I think, Alfred Crosby has this concept of like ecological imperialism, right? All of the things that are brought along with humans into the spaces that they colonize. And so I think a lot of what I'm trying to think about is how do we outline all of these things in such a way that the planning, the design work, the engineering can come to incorporate this such that maybe we don't have to do that in the first place. And also to make it, I think, a more democratic political project. Yeah, I'm sorry if that answers your question. But I think one of the especially interesting things that has been challenging in outer space law in general has been the like rise of commercial actors, and that there is almost no sense of how to govern that. And so no sense of how to govern these private actors who have started kind of, I mean, we have huge space pollution problems now, and there isn't really a sense of how to deal with that, simply because private actors are really not the focus of like the Outer Space Treaty. And so in a lot of ways, what's interesting is how we're already living with the kind of holes in this framework, but what kinds of patches can be developed to make it better.
It was somewhat similar when I was thinking about, the role of markets in this, and thinking about colonization as also an economic action, right? So you talked about exploitation, but you almost talked about it without the economy aspect to it. And so is there a way for which you to think about sort of the four rules or implications of the framework and think about it as how it's also stagnant or static and unable to address these actors, and how sort of that in itself is a fundamental contradiction in which you have the most lively sort of work being done outside by rogue actors looking for a frontier for a market, which is in many ways exactly the story of many forms of colonization, right? It's cowboys that went out on their own right before the law, before a rule of law could have been settled. And of course, then law comes after, right? But it's almost as if these two stories are, I don't know. My sense is, if I think of common patterns, it's almost as if these two stories are happening at the same time.
Yes.
The other one that I was thinking about is, your story is really about the commons, right? And about sort of the public good as a form of colonization. And how does this and these other, I just keep thinking of SpaceX. And these other actors are the typical sort of ways that we think of colonization. And you have this sort of new opportunity to think about how these two things mesh with each other at the exact same time.
Right, right. Thank you for that. And spot on. I think, some of what I did more in the actual chapter is thinking about what exploitation actually means. Because I think a lot of the way that exploitation is even characterized in this space has a lot to do with science and freedom of science, which I think connects to another sort of lineage of like international colonial administration, which was very much about sending agricultural technicians into places to figure out how to develop the land. And, they would literally create research stations. And so there is absolutely an economic, I think, piece to this. The piece on the commons, what's interesting about this is that, the commons is kind of seen as supposed to be the antithesis of colonization and colonialism, and yet it's the very mode through which this new colonial regime is being constructed. And so the other, there's a battle actually that is going on behind these frameworks between the US model and the Soviet model, which is the Soviet model is very much pushing for states being the only actors who have rights in space, that all space activities must go through the state. And of course, the US being like, absolutely not. And that, we would like to see liberty and the rights of private actors at least be recognized, even if they have to come through the state. And so, it's very much along the same lines as the kind of like political polarities of the Cold War period that this is sort of emerging out of. And so I think that it hasn't been resolved. It's just kind of like this core contradiction that the Outer Space Treaty, as this negotiated treaty trying to just get people to not put weapons of mass destruction into outer space, incorporates both of them in ways that our present reality now is not really able to make much sense of.
All right, thank you so much. I was thinking along very similar lines to Christina. So I think my question is kind of in two parts. So the first part, I was wondering if you could unpack the word representation a little bit, because we that sounds like it's quite central to how you're thinking. So on the one hand, there's representation in the sense of speaking on behalf of, which, as you said, is this really broad project. But then on the other hand, there's representation, right? Say, like, restating who, and I'm thinking it's who we are, what,
Right.
thinking with Winter, it's as much about the other as it is about the self and who we are. That's one. And then following from that, I was wondering if you have a sense of the historical change in these meanings around the self and the world making projects that come from this kind of world. You know, specifically it sounds like the epoch that you're looking at is the Cold War, the post-World War, the middle of the century, the Cold War, this arms rattling, but then now we're moving into this world of phallic corporate Elon Musk type project moving into space. So I was wondering whether through the politics of the world that you're looking at, you're telling us something about, you know, the changing world making projects of the we and the self.
Yeah, that's excellent. And I especially like the way that you ended that, because that connects the two, I think, questions. Because, so I should say that the broader, you know, my dissertation is looking at 3 periods: the post-World War I period, and the effort to establish a like formalized, institutionalized international system that would be global. The effort after World War II to institutionalize a pan-human community and an identity, culture, almost humanity is like a people, which is expressed through the human rights frameworks that are developed during that period. And then this 3rd period is thinking about what happens when that we that has been constructed is then extended, or the project to extend it into spaces. And part of what I'm working through is, you know, whether I want to call this almost like a cycle or not. I think calling it a cycle invites like a need for the kind of comparative analysis that I'm in some ways kind of taking a step back from, because I don't think that the state projects are the same as a project of global governance, which has a lot more sort of limitations on what can be done in the space of like developing governance practices. However, I do think that there is this like 50-year project of trying to construct a we, and to increasingly formalize that we, and to give it these kinds of material dimensions that outer space activities are very much about, like doing humanity. And in that sense, like that presentational dimension, that performative dimension of it is very much, I think, a part of how they are conceptualizing what it means to be in outer space in general. And so that idea of performing humankind, performing humanity, and needing to sort of engage in these practices of colonization in order to perform that is, I think, very similar to what I do point to in some of the analysis is relationships between like empire formation and nation building within historical colonial projects, like in Germany and in the Netherlands, and Spain and others, where it's like you're looking at simultaneously, right, not in any kind of like asynchronous way, actually trying to produce both the empire and the nation at the same time. I think that that's somewhat at work here, but now we're not dealing with nations, we're dealing with another kind of political unity, another kind of politics. So, but I'm still thinking on that. So thank you for bringing that up.
What a wonderful topic that gives us a lens into so many things that we might be thinking about. So thank you. It's great. Couple perspectives that I just personally had. And one was your comment, and I may not be using your words exactly right, but something about agency.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned the dual agency of having acted in space and then represented the people. So for instance, the United States could launch a rocket with an astronaut, and that's a fact. So yeah, that they have that agency. But then the other part of that, as I heard it, was the representation of the American people. And that it's not clear. So I saw two, that raised, again, that was a lens on two things, that yes, they have the power to launch a rocket, but then they're speaking on behalf of the nation, and that's a very different thing. And that, somewhere in the questions, that led to a thought, who represents the moon? And who represents the people who might be the residents of the moon? Because we're doing that in our makeshift and segmented way. But there was this idea of the moon as an entity with its resources. And whoever might end up being the population of the moon, who represents that entity, and that's the next phase.
Right. Thank you for that. Because I think this goes back to these kind of layers of
Yeah.
representation and acting, and like how voices are constructed within the broader discourse of outer space in general. The first part, I think, this is the kind of, weird, just for lack of a better word, part of the discourse of this period, which is there are so many ways in which the language of internationalism is used for nationalist interests. And so in a lot of ways, I think particularly both the US and the Soviet Union are trying to position themselves or frame themselves as acting on behalf of everyone when they're really just acting on behalf of themselves. And so that's, on the one hand, a kind of rhetorical strategy, and it's something that was pointed out in the negotiation of these frameworks. For instance, the United Arab Republic was another kind of voice within the space of creating the legal principles and the treaty. And they said, we want to make sure, and so because of them, the language was included that, the equal rights to the free exploration and use of space would be done for the benefit of all mankind. And the other clause in there is regardless of, or irrespective of economic or scientific development. So, right, just because you have the capacity to go into space does not mean that you get to act unilaterally and shaping what is ultimately a landscape that everyone will have to, again, deal with the wake of. And so there's absolutely this tension and between, who is ultimately being represented kind of, and, when these kinds of claims are being made. But I think also, I'm sorry, the second part of your question was
Who represents
the moon, right?
and the people who might be the residents of the moon.
Right. So this is a big.
And I love your term, the voices,
Mhm.
your response using voices. That's, how do we derive the voices for the moon and the people?
Right, and this is a part of the kinds of when people have, just in popular conversations talked about, the future of colonization, a lot of it has to do with, okay, well, what happens when people do start living on the moon? Or what happens when they're living on asteroids? Are those colonies, are we going to kind of reproduce this cycle of okay, then they're going to have their own nationalist movements and they're going to want to break away from the empire. That's what you see a lot in speculative fiction. And so there's this kind of anticipatory conversation about, okay, well, what happens when the permanent research station is established on the moon? And in what ways is the current framework constraining the kind of democratic possibilities that might exist, such that the moon, setting aside the idea of the moon as an ecology, being able to be represented just on its own, I think that's closer to kind of these more than human indigenous cosmologies that I mentioned at the beginning. But how does that figure into the broader kind of political structure of a kind of more than earthen or more than terrestrial existence? It's still open. Thank you.
Well, I was very hopeful when you started, and then as it went, I started to feel oh my gosh, we're too late to fix anything. And then you got to the implications, I felt hopeful again. I'm curious, how do you imagine that these implications could actually interrupt and impact the frameworks, the colonialist frameworks that are kind of already in place? Like, are these actionable items in a way, I guess is one of my questions. And are there some decolonial projects that have provided ways out of this colonial model as we are, since it is still, it's now, but it's also in the future.
Right.
So is there still hope for making not such colonialist moves?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think so. I mean, ultimately, but the work is to really radicalize how we think of how law is made, and also the relationship between social science and social theory and the making of law. Part of what I point to are these kinds of efforts by, academics, researchers, scholars, to reconfigure how it is that we produce knowledge about the social world, such that a kind of more human framework would even be possible in the first place. Because at the end of the day, those are the kinds of models that lawmakers draw on. And part of the issue is that a lot of these lawmakers are drawing on very old social theory. And so it is very colonialist, it's very developmentalist, it's about exploitation. It's about the idea of humanity being able to express itself through exploitation. And so part of it is, okay, how do we create both better social theory and sort of more recognized social theory for those who are involved in the direct planning and the design? I think a lot of it is also the broader, I'm going to use the word representational again, but it's really about speculative fiction. And what in future studies have been kind of conceptualized as the speculative practices, that speculation itself, like the desire to, or the act of imagining the future, is kind of producing this discourse of what the future could be. So this is going to sound really cheesy, but it's up to all of us, but in many ways, it is very much about how we rethink the kind of knowledge that's being made about the future. Developing a sociology of outer space or of Star Trek or other speculative practices, such that there is a stronger voice that lawmakers could draw on, that engineers, so that it isn't just Elon Musk and others who very much believe in a very conservative model of what humanity is and what it should do. It's that kind of active work. And I will say that a lot of this draws on research that it's becoming, I think, more prominent from more than human social studies scholars and people in the humanities and interdisciplinary folks who are really actively doing this work. So I'm hopeful because a lot of this are things that are not only far in the future, but I think that can develop multiple models to kind of figure their way into how to resolve, or not resolve, but kind of reconcile them as sort of new law is made. Because there is currently no real, I think, much will to create something like a new outer space treaty, in large part because of how they saw how difficult it was to get people to kind of agree to the first one. So we'll see.
Thank you.
Questions, thoughts?
I just have a comment. But it's quite eerie. There's this whole literature in sort of 19th century British imperialism about sci-fi, and basically the way in which people were dreaming up a white world order. And the reason why I say it's eerie is because they use exactly the same language that you were reading out through these legal treaties. And it's all about, Cecil Rhodes, for example, was obsessed with science fiction and in imagining sort of the dream world of a white man's world. And it's the same, not just the same processes, but actually the same kind of vocabulary that you read out in those treaties.
Yeah, there is, mentioning, Elon Musk again, the fact that he's a eugenicist and also very interested in the futures of humanity, that's not a coincidence. And so I think that there are a lot of folks who get involved in speculative scientific work because they're interested in producing a master race or in a very specific vision of the future. One of the main theoretical astrophysicists of this period, Michael Hart, who develops theories that have to do with, that are still cited about, the prevalence of certain kinds of civilizational forms and things like that are, he is someone who is an avowed white separatist. He speaks at the New Century Foundation and it's very clear that he's a white supremacist. And so I'm very interested in these intersections, for another project about how we can talk about how the future is being shaped by ultimately these deeply far-right ideas, even in spaces that are thought to be depoliticized and through work like an equation, right? How's an equation political? And how do we depoliticize that? So, thank you.
A couple minutes. I was gonna ask, you could say, it seems like some of these potential interventions require, and one part is rethinking what we think race is, right? So you make this argument about humankind, the kind of racial project. So I just wanted to hear you say a bit more about what kind of shift in our conceptualization of race or racialization is required to perhaps open up us being able to engage with some of these pivots.
Right. Thank you for that, because that is the crux of the dissertation. Why is it important to think about race in more many ways? And part of it is this disjuncture kind of idea that we're reproducing the thing that we're supposed to be doing. And just because it doesn't involve divisions between humans doesn't mean that that's not going to be important for the future. That there are, especially in a lot of colonial knowledge systems, it wasn't just about divisions between human groups, but also between divisions, between humans and non-human beings. And so how do we undo those inheritances, of which race is a part, but also there's been great work by a lot of feminist scholars to talk about the species concept and how that concept has become racialized and what it would look like to try and de-racialize that. And so a lot of this is to say that, we spend a lot of time, rightfully so, understanding the history, the global histories of race, the race concept, race making, race thinking, but then we also have to attend to its futures, because as of now, it does have a future, and it's very prominent in the discourses of science and science fiction. And is that something that we want? And if we don't want that, then how do we de-racialize those discourses and practices? I argue, just from my perspective, of course, and this is in line with a lot of thinking that has been about the forms of community that have been suppressed, forms of genealogy, of lineage, of ancestry that have been suppressed by colonial systems historically, which are these more than human communities, more than human kinship. And so in what ways can we perhaps think about some of those models more as a kind of alternative to these racialized conceptions of political community, of subjectivity, and of political futures? Thank you for that.
Another side of for this question of potential hopes and thinking otherwise about these things. So thank you so much, Prince.
Thank you.
Thank you.